I think those were the ones that were more successful. We also had this situation, Chris, you probably remember. Everybody was purchasing work from home equipment, and there was a shortage, and in some cases still is in some geographic locations, of headsets and webcams, and those who had an external monitor versus those who didn't, and your ability to focus on the screen. Some of that digital divide, I'll say, due to shortages or due to lack of resources, created different experiences for different learners. And so I think those who gave grace, who gave recognition that, it's okay. That is absolutely okay. We're going to work with what we have. We'll make the best of it. We're here to learn. We're not here to make sure you have a perfectly coiffed background around you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomena because on the one hand, the usage of video went from, we're going to talk about your research in a minute, and I'm really shocked when I look back just last year at how the lack of prevalence of video, because now it's everything. And it may be even tyrannical, to your point. I've got to be on video all day. When will people remember that it's okay just to have a phone call or send an email? I think that's a lesson that we've got to learn. But I think your point is very well taken about having an open conversation about this and agreeing on what works for us in a given context is probably the most important. Were there any other sort of additional challenges that facilitators and trainers faced, except for just the massive amount of workload that came their way last year?
I think a couple of things still are important to mention. And one is dealing with the platforms that they either had or had access to. There's a lot of web conferencing platforms out there, and they are not all created equal. So we had some organizations who already had a classroom platform or a virtual training platform or a way for their learners to still communicate, and they were well poised for success. And then we had the organizations who their IT department just dictated to them, well, you can use this and nothing else. And that may or may not have served the purpose for what was needed. I liken it to if you're in an in-person office and you're told to do a training class in a conference room with a boardroom table that you can't move, but you had planned some sort of experiential exercise. That's different than a training room that you have tables and things you can move around. Learning and development professionals are going to make it work and try to make that experience work. But having a platform, and I've heard from many learning and development professionals, if only my IT department or my leadership, I could get buy-in for the platform that's going to allow me to do training the way it needs to be done, not just some sort of check the box online experience. So I think a lot of organizations bumped into that last year.
Yeah, interesting. I definitely want to come back to the technology and your point of view on the platforms, because there's been a lot of change, some of it good, some of it less good. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your survey. You've taken an annual survey for a few years. I looked back a couple of years in the prep for this call. It was really interesting. Presumably that's amongst your clients and its trainers and learning leaders. Can you talk a little bit about the demographics of it? And also, what did you learn? I think the last one you did was maybe a couple of months after the pandemic kind of really made an impact last year. So it'd be great to hear what you learned in the white heat of that transformation.
Yes. So I do an annual survey and I put it out to anybody who is able to respond to it. So my clients, I put it out on social media, ask everyone to share it. So this past year, 2020, the survey was done in the May-June timeframe and had almost 900 responses from around the globe. And I do ask a few demographic information around the role and experience with virtual learning, but global audience in various learning and development roles. And there were some really interesting insights that came out this year. One of them, we already mentioned, the explosion of video, the number of people who are using it, and the reasons why. Not surprising if bandwidth gets in the way, or in some organizations, the end users aren't equipped with laptops that have webcams, or they don't want to use their personal devices that may have webcams. So that somebody wrote in, and I just love the quote that we ask people to be on webcam, but bandwidth and bad hair days get in the way. So we're a little flexible on that. But facilitators are typically, and much more so now, on webcam. So that was one of the insights. Another insight that I found really surprising when I ask a question about the typical length of a virtual training class. So for historically, the past couple of years, 1 hour is the most common, between an hour and 90 minutes. It's been hovering at. This year, the number of people who said long 4 hour, 6 hour, 8 hour classes, and I think that's largely due to the number of people who just quickly converted a full day class online. So I'll be really interested to see next year, once we have a chance to step back and look at the designs, if that's a trend that continues or if that was just a one-time blip. The other insight is that I ask a question, how long does it take you to develop 1 hour of interactive virtual learning? And ATD's done some research on this over the years. We've seen it. It has been coming down dramatically. This survey revealed 9 hours of development time for 1 hour of interactive. And when I put that out there in revealing the results, I got a lot of anecdotal, no way, that's way too low. That's way too little for what's really needed. But again, due to the pivot, due to the timing that we have, and the number of people who said online learning to them just means an online presentation. So I think we've got some just interesting data points there.
What was the baseline on that 9 hours from before?
Last year it was 21. The year before that, and some of the research that ATD has done has been up in the 40-hour range. So pretty significant drops over the past few years, whether that's we're reusing content or we're just not making it as interactive, or it could be in some organizations who have been doing virtual learning. They already had a baseline. It didn't take them as long. It's worth looking into a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it may just be the scramble as well to move a lot of stuff online. I was looking through the surveys. I'd love to know how long you've been doing the surveys. Like last year, I was really staggered that just 10% of formal programs were online from your survey. And this year, I think over 90% of people said they were increasing the amount. The big pivot that we all saw is borne out by your data. But what does adoption look like over the entire history of your surveys or in your experience?
Well, I've been doing the survey since 2018, so this is the third annual. However, I started looking at the data much earlier than that as I was writing some of my books on virtual training. And some of the earlier research, if we look at the ATD State of the Industry report, the Training Magazine annual industry report, those numbers, even back in the 2005, 2006, 2007 range, very small percentages of all formal learning was taking place online in the 3, 4, 5, and it's been hovering in the 10 to 14% range over the last 10 years or so. It's a portion of online formal learning, but not a significant portion. 2020 skyrocketed it. Chris, it's kind of like a roller coaster that chug, chug, chug up the hill. And then 2020 came and we went flying downhill. And I think some of it will go back to in-person when we're able to, but it's not going to be a huge pendulum swing now that organizations are realizing you can do it and you can do it well.
Well, I do want to give a shout out for your books and your work and your resources. You have a ton of resources on your website and in your books about how people can get good at designing great interactive sessions, about leading sessions. I wanted to really focus in this conversation about what's going on strategically, but I do want to give a shout out for those resources, and we'll put links to those in the show notes of the podcast. Could we talk about what we learned in 2020, particularly what you learned, the insights that you were able to gain? And I think there's sort of two areas that I want to focus on. One is what's going on with the technology and platforms. And then what do we think are the implications for the future of learning development in terms of what we learn? We went from 10 or 20% of programs online to 100%, pretty much. And there was a lot of changes going on the platforms that we use to do that. So I don't know whether you agree with this, but I was looking at the data in your survey. And initially, we use platforms that were sort of made for training. They may not have been good. They have evolved over time. And I'm thinking about, some of the WebEx platforms or the GoToTraining, those kind of platforms. And yet the data in your survey shows this massive leap in the more generic online communication platforms, particularly Zoom and particularly Microsoft Teams. So I wonder if you think, they were never intended for training. They were just intended for meetings and online communications. So did we end up taking a step backwards? Was that a challenge? What do you think happened generally with platforms last year?
Wow, Chris, I think we could talk about this specific topic for hours. So, a couple of key thoughts. First of all, you're right that especially historically, we had platforms that were designed for meetings, platform designed for really large events like webinars or webcasts, and then our platforms designed for training classes. And maybe the same vendor had three different products that we used for those three different purposes. And some of the platforms started to change, to evolve in the past 2, 3 years to handle more than one of those types. Zoom's a great example of it. It's Zoom for meetings, but by just enabling their breakouts or their private chat or some of the other traditional training features, we had this platform that could do or could handle multiple types of online events. Now, what's happened in the last year, the last 10 months, the rapid innovations that have been coming out by all of the major platforms. I can't think of one that has not had a major overhaul in the last year, from GoToTraining to WebEx to Adobe Connect to Zoom, even Microsoft Teams. Significant features. It's a little bit of keeping up with each other, I think. One comes out with a feature, the rest of them come out with that same feature. And that's a good thing, I think. They're spurring one another on. The challenge is some of them are still in I'm not sure the right word to use, but they're still, because of their history in meetings or their history in where they came from, they're struggling a little more with that training component. But the IT department in many large organizations doesn't move as quickly as some training departments might like. And so the learning and development teams are needing to work with what they have. Now, you can make anything work. The analogy I use sometimes, Chris, is if you're going to go to the best Mexican restaurant, are you going to order spaghetti? Right? Probably not, because that's not what it's known for. And so if you give a learning department a meeting platform to do training with, they'll make it work, but it's not really the ideal scenario. So I work with L&D departments a lot to build a business case to get a platform. Now, here's the other component of that, Chris, and I think it's worth mentioning. Some of the platforms, and Zoom and Teams are two examples of them, GoToTraining is another, because they're based more on screen sharing as opposed to bringing information into the shell or the container, it opens up so many more tools that can be integrated or used. So we're seeing an explosion of things like collaborative whiteboards or other collaboration spaces that we can now use where we weren't able to do that. So the innovation and the creativity that is now available that perhaps we didn't have before now is a trend that I'd like to see continue, and a trend that I think we're going to see continue.
Can you explain that a little bit? You mean because these platforms allow people to use third-party tools in the context of a meeting rather than just constrain them to the box that represents the training platform?
Yes, you said that very eloquently. That's exactly it. The integration with third party, the integration with other apps, or the integration with other features and functionalities. Now, all the platforms technically can do it. Some it's just easier to do than others.
Well, let's get geeky on this then. What are the sort of killer features that emerged last year? I want to say how I tracked last year was by attending lots of conferences, which is something that I do for my work.